Justice in the modern world is supposed to be blind, but in the Middle Ages, it was scalding hot and terrifyingly visible. Imagine being pregnant, vulnerable, and accused of a crime you may not have committed. Your judge isn't a person, it's a pot of violently boiling water. Your defense attorney isn't a lawyer, it's the hope that God will magically heal your third-degree burns. For women accused of adultery or conceiving out of wedlock, the path to innocence wasn't a trial, it was a torture chamber, disguised as divine intervention. There was no presumption of innocence, only a presumption of sin that required a physical miracle to erase. This wasn't just a legal system, it was a theater of cruelty where the stage props were fire and iron, and the main act was the destruction of a woman's body. Let's step into a world where divine judgment meant plunging your hand into a cauldron or walking on fire. These weren't metaphors, they were literal, physical tests designed to break you. Known as ordeals, these trials were built on the fanatical belief that God would perform a miracle to save the innocent. But for a pregnant woman, the stress alone was enough to induce a miscarriage, turning a trial for sin into a double murder. The church sanctioned these tortures under the guise of holiness, effectively weaponizing faith against the female body. The system was rigged from the start, a gruesome game where the only winning move was a miracle that never came. But boiling water was just the appetizer on this menu of horrors. If you thought that was bad, wait until you see what they did with red-hot iron. One of the most infamous ordeals was the trial by boiling water. A stone or ring was dropped into a pot of bubbling liquid, and the accused woman had to reach in and fish it out with her bare hand. Her scalded, blistering arm was then wrapped in bandages and sealed for 3 days. When the wrappings were removed, the verdict was delivered. If the wound had healed cleanly, she was innocent. If it was infected, which, given medieval hygiene, was almost guaranteed she was guilty, the crowd would watch with bated breath, not for a sign of healing, but for the first sign of rot that would seal her doom. It was a biological coin toss, where the bacteria on your skin decided whether you lived or died. For a pregnant woman, the physical trauma of the burn combined with the terror of the weight often triggered early labor or fatal infections. But the authorities didn't see a tragedy, they saw God's will. To them, a festering wound was a divine receipt of guilt. And if water wasn't your element, there was always fire. In the ordeal of hot iron, a woman had to carry a glowing white-hot iron bar for a set number of steps. Every step she took was a testament to the twisted logic that claimed agony was the only path to truth. Her flesh would sizzle and smoke as she walked, the smell of her own burning skin serving as incense for a twisted ritual of purity. Imagine the agony of holding fire while carrying a child. But physical pain was fleeting compared to the permanent mark they left on you if you survived. If the ordeals didn't kill you, the shame would. In parts of medieval France, like Normandy, the law allowed for a punishment that lasted a lifetime: branding. A pregnant woman, accused of adultery, would be tied to a post in the village square. An executioner would step forward with a branding iron glowing orange from the coals. The smoke rising from her skin served as a grim signal to the crowd that order had been restored through violence. With one brutal motion, he would press the metal against her face, permanently burning the label of adulterer into her cheek or forehead. The smell of scorched flesh would fill the air, a sensory warning to every other woman in the town. That scar wasn't just an injury, it was a social death sentence. It meant that for the rest of her life, everyone who looked at her would know her crime. She became a walking billboard for sin, ostracized and humiliated every time she stepped out her door. She would be refused service at markets and shunned in church, effectively becoming a ghost within her own village. In a society where reputation was currency, this was bankruptcy carved into the skin. But in England, they preferred a different kind of public theater. They didn't always use iron. Sometimes they used a simple white sheet and a walk of shame that could break a spirit just as effectively. In cities like York and London, the church courts favored public penance. A pregnant woman found guilty of fornication would be stripped of her outer clothes, dressed in a plain white sheet, and forced to walk barefoot through her parish. Carrying a candle or wearing a sign detailing her sins, she had to confess aloud to the jeering crowds. The cold stones under her feet and the jeers of the crowd combined to break her spirit long before the walk was finished. It was a parade of humiliation, designed to strip away every shred of dignity while her neighbors, people she had known her whole life, watched and judged. This wasn't just about punishing the woman, it was about terrorizing the community. By making her suffering public, the church sent a clear message: morality is not private. Your body belongs to the public, and your shame is our entertainment. These moments were meticulously recorded in court rolls, ensuring that her degradation was preserved in ink forever. It was a calculated display of power intended to remind every woman in the parish that her reputation hung by a thread. She was forced to be the star of her own tragedy, performing her shame for an audience that thrived on her destruction. But words and walking weren't enough for some zealots. For those who believed pain was the only way to purity, there was the whip. By the 12th century, a new form of justice had moved from the monasteries to the streets: flagellation. Whipping wasn't just for monks anymore, it was for pregnant women who dared to break the rules. The church claimed this was corrective, a way to save the soul by beating the sin out of the flesh. Blood would stain the cobblestones, marking her path of atonement with the physical evidence of her suffering. A woman might be whipped while walking through the market, each lash tearing into her skin as a physical reminder of the community's disapproval. Theologians like Peter Damian argued that bodily suffering was a gift, a way to mimic Christ's pain. But for a pregnant woman, this gift was a nightmare. She wasn't just taking the blows for herself, she was taking them for the unborn child she carried. The sanctity of the unborn life was completely ignored in favor of making a brutal example out of the mother. Every strike of the whip was a double punishment, risking the life of the baby to satisfy the moral bloodlust of the crowd. The cruelty lay in the belief that her pregnancy was proof of guilt. Her growing belly was the evidence against her, a visible sign of her crime that no lawyer could argue away. But sometimes, the punishment wasn't loud or violent. Sometimes it was quiet, cold, and endless. For women from wealthy families or nuns who broke their vows, the punishment was often disappearance. They were sent to monastic imprisonment, locked away in stone cells within convents. This wasn't a retreat, it was a tomb for the living. Cut off from the sun and human touch, she was left to rot in a stone box while the world outside forgot her name. Pregnant nuns, having broken the sacred vow of chastity, were seen as a cancer in the church, and the cure was total isolation. Some were locked in cells for months, others for life. Silence was mandatory. Contact with the outside world was forbidden. The goal was social erasure, to hide the scandal behind thick walls, so the family's honor remained intact. The emotional amputation of losing her child was often more painful than any physical torture the church could devise. She would give birth in silence, her baby taken away to a foundling home, while she remained behind, a ghost, haunting the corridors of her own prison. This was framed as mercy, a way to protect her from public shame. But in reality, it was about control, controlling the narrative, controlling the bloodline, and controlling the woman by making her vanish. And then there was the ultimate rejection: banishment. For a pregnant woman without a husband or a powerful family, the village council could simply order her to leave, go, and never return. It sounds simple, but in the Middle Ages, it was a death sentence. With the city gates slammed shut behind her, she faced a wilderness that offered no mercy to a lone, pregnant woman. Exile meant losing your support network, your home, and your identity. You became a non-person, drifting from town to town, rejected by everyone because you carried the mark of the outcast. This policy was driven by a fear of moral pollution. A pregnant, unmarried woman was seen as a virus that could infect the community's reputation, so they cut her out like a tumor. She would be forced to wander the roads, often turning to begging or prostitution just to feed herself and her child. Many perished from exposure or starvation, their bodies found on roadsides as silent testaments to the cruelty of moral communities. She was erased from the village records, erased from memory, and left to survive in the wolves' den of the medieval wilderness. These punishments, fire, whips, exile, weren't about justice. They were about power. They were about drawing a line in the sand and using a woman's body to show what happens when you cross it. The medieval world was a place where fear ruled fear of God, fear of sin, fear of women. When you combine that fear with the absolute power of the church and the state, you get a system that brutalizes the most vulnerable. It was a systemic machinery of oppression that used the excuse of divine law to keep women in a state of perpetual terror. The pregnant body became a battlefield where society fought its war against disorder, and the casualties were always the women. These stories might seem like ancient history, echoes from a barbaric past, but look closer. The obsession with controlling women's bodies, the public shaming of female sexuality, the judgment passed on mothers, are these things really gone? Or have they just changed shape? We must recognize that the policing of women's bodies has always been about power, not morality. The shadow of the branding iron still lingers in our laws and our culture, a reminder that the fight for autonomy is far from over. If this journey into the dark history of medieval justice shocked you, don't let it be forgotten. Hit that like button to honor those who suffered in silence. Subscribe and ring the bell to join us as we uncover more hidden truths. Let us know in the comments. Do you think we've truly moved past these medieval mindsets? See you next time.